What's up, guys? Today I'm going to make a video about this particular safety pen here. This happens to be my first safety pen, and for me as like a fountain pen user, I've always not really had a huge thing for vintage pens, but there are some vintage pens that have pretty cool mechanisms in them, and the safety pen is definitely one of them. For those of you who don't know, safety pens have, as you can see, or can't see, a retractable nib. So how they work is that they're generally eyedropper filled, so when you actually have the pen capped, the nib is retracted into the body. In order to fill it, you would just take an eyedropper, drop ink directly into the barrel, and then when you want to use the pen, you turn a knob, and the nib that gets retracted into the body comes back out. It seals up the section area here, and the eyedroppered ink would then flow through the feed to the nib, and you'd be able to write with it. And then when you're done writing with it, all you have to do is twist the nib away and then close it back up. Obviously this isn't filled right now. When you are using it filled, you're going to want to stand it upright, where the camera, pointing towards the camera. That way you don't actually spill ink all over the place. This particular pen is a Williamson brand pen. From what I've gathered, they're an Italian company and they weren't really around for that long, maybe a few years. I think maybe they had other manufacturers produce their pens for them. But I couldn't really find much information on it. I think when I looked it up online, I saw there was maybe one other post about Williamson pens, and then the auction for this particular pen came up. I'd gotten this pen for around $90, shipped from France. The seller said that it was in working condition. There's a slight ding on the cap, but otherwise I think it's in pretty great shape. He did say that the sealing cork was replaced, and in this instance, when I got the pen, it was leaking from this back, I don't want to say piston area, but I mean, I guess normally it would be a piston. It's not a piston fill pen, but this would be normally like where the piston knob is. It was leaking very minorly from there, and unfortunately in this type of pen, having even a minor leak just won't work. When I had taken the pen apart, the seal actually had been replaced, so it's not like the guy lied about replacing the cork seal or anything. I guess it just wasn't the greatest of fits, or maybe there were some micro cracks in the cork. I'm not entirely sure, but either way, I tried sealing it up with extra silicone grease, and it wasn't enough to help prevent the leaks. There were also several other problems. The nib is a global nib on here. I'm not actually sure if this is the factory nib that usually comes with the pen, because like I said, I couldn't really find much information on it. Let's see if I can get it to focus. You can kind of see it, I guess, minus the reflection from the light. It's a 14 karat nib. It's actually kind of soft. I wouldn't want to necessarily say it's like a flex nib by any means. You can get a very slight bit of line variation with it, with minimal pressure, but I wouldn't necessarily use it as a flex pen. I have other pens for that. The nib and feed weren't exactly set properly. I don't know if the seller was the one that happened to replace this nib. Like if this isn't the standard factory nib, maybe it got replaced and it just wasn't set properly. I had set it properly, and even after that there were still some flow issues, and I kind of had to fiddle around with placing the nib and feed back into the body that it sits in, that the section that retracts into the body of the pen. I didn't want to actually have to mess with carving out any of the hard rubber feed or anything, just because I don't think I would necessarily be able to easily find replacement parts for it. But I managed to get it writing, pretty well. If I do flex it, it does run dry of ink and will railroad, and I think there's a minor problem with the air transfer, and sometimes an air bubble builds up right at the end of the feed, and it doesn't allow ink to flow back freely. So it's still something I'm kind of tinkering with and working on. And because of the leak, after I had taken it apart, I had actually realized that the helix inside that retracts this nib was actually cracked. and I don't think that's necessarily uncommon with safety pens. I believe most safety pens, generally, if you find one that's considered unrestored, you're more than likely going to definitely have to get the cork seal replaced because they will rot. And the second thing is, generally the helixes will also crack because during use, if the user isn't careful, they can put a lot of pressure along the helix, and they're only made out of hard rubber, and pretty thin hard rubber at that. So they do tend to crack, and people can just, glue them back into place. This one was actually glued back, and it can work. Like, obviously, with the original parts, you can still see that it retracts, and comes back out, no problems. But that's not necessarily the best way of restoring it. You can just kind of have to find either a replacement helix, or you can get hollow ebonite rod stock and just carve out the grooves for the helix. So I'll just take this pen apart and kind of show you guys inside how it works. So what you want to do actually is you want to actually have the nib all the way out, and then at this point you can start turning, this back portion here, the housing knob for this mechanism, and then as you can see, like after I've basically started turning that knob back, the nib retracts, and then you're going to want to bring the nib back out again by just turning the very bottom portion, and then repeating this process until everything slips out. Almost there. Like that. Whoops. Everything's falling apart. So as you can see, inside is a housing like this. There are holes here for ink to be able to get to the nib and the feed. The nib and feed in this instance is just friction fit into this piece. You can see there's also a helix here. In this case, it actually happens to be a double helix, and this is held on to place by that cotter pin right there where my thumbnail is, and then as you rotate this bottom portion, it rotates the helix. This section here is then pinned into the helix by a very small hard rubber pin, and that feeds through the helix, and what ends up happening is as you turn the knob, it rides along the helix. That pin rides along the helix and forces the nib to come in and out, or in this case, side to side. Inside the body of the pen, I'm not sure if I'll be able to actually show you, but there is actually a groove. Oops. Come on. I'm probably not going to be able to get it to focus properly, especially with this lighting. But there is a groove right there that this pin happens to sit right into. So you can see that if I were to place that back with the pin in place, if I just insert it, it's going to hit the body of the pen, and I actually have to twist it until that hard rubber pin falls into that groove, and then I can start screwing everything back together. So in terms of doing repairs, I didn't have any cork seals, and I also had to get a replacement helix for this one because it was cracked. It is still serviceable, but it's only a matter of time before it breaks again. So my solution was basically to 3D print a helix. So here you can see I have one printed out. It's made out of the PLA filament that standard 3D printers print with. If you actually look closely, I actually didn't get the model drawn up properly. With the original is actually a double helix. You can kind of see it like right through it, while this is actually just a single helix. I just didn't get the coils done properly. It isn't a big deal. It still works. The biggest concern with that is that when I actually have this inserted in, this pin, oops, let's not drop that. This pin actually doesn't go all the way through, so it actually sticks out too much. And what also ends up happening is, as I twist it, there's more pressure kind of leaning towards one side than the other. But because this is a helix that I just printed out, I can always get another one made. I actually have 2 spares. I had gotten 2 made out of PLA and 1 made out of acrylic, and the acrylic wasn't finished very well, and it doesn't actually fit properly, so I still have to work on that. But both of the PLA ones fit perfectly fine and they work perfectly well. So because this didn't work, I basically just had to find a small piece of plastic. I didn't want to use metal because I didn't want to gouge out the sidewall body of hard rubber. And also I didn't want to have anything that would react negatively to ink. So I just got a small piece of plastic rod that I just cut a small section of. As you can see, it's slightly shorter than the original hard rubber pin because, like I said, this no longer feeds all the way through the helix. And then I can get the cotter pin out. The cotter pin was actually glued in with the helix along where the cracks were, and I actually kind of had to get in there with an X-Acto knife and kind of just chip away some of the, I don't know whether this is shellac or what, but I just chipped it away and I was able to punch out the cotter pin. If you look, this is the original helix, and you can see it was cracked there. You can see the glue marks and the crack through the hole where the cotter pin rests through, and then you can see the cracks also lead up to the very edge of the helix. Inside this section here, this is two parts. One part is this rod that the helix sits onto, and this is the part that you turn on the outside, and then this is the housing. And you probably won't be able to see, but usually inside there is a cork seal. In its place right now, I've basically used a small O-ring that just fits, the inner diameter of the O-ring just slightly fits around this rod, and then the actual cross-section of the O-ring is 1/16 of an inch. That's what happened. That is the size that my hardware store happened to have. It's this one here, and it fits well enough. I just used some silicone grease to make sure the seal is really tight, make sure everything kind of slides evenly without excessive friction, and it works. I made sure to thoroughly test it before actually putting the pen in my pockets and carrying it, just in case there were any leaks that developed during use or during carry, and I've so far had no issues whatsoever. So I'll just go ahead and put everything back together here. So like I said, in here, are O-rings. You could probably stack a few O-rings in there. I just used one and it happened to work out just fine. And you can see I have a good amount of silicone grease on there. So this piece goes in, fits in like so. The helix that I printed out, in order to get the hole made for the cotter pins, I didn't actually have a drill bit that would actually be small enough, and I was a little concerned that if I started drilling the something of this thin of wall, that it would actually crack. So what I ended up using was just like a sewing needle that was close in size to the cotter pin, heated up under a torch, and just kind of pushed it through and melted in, and then went in with an X-Acto knife and cleaned everything up. One hole I made a little too big, the other hole is just perfectly snug. Either way, it still worked out fine. So you just kind of have to get the holes lined up, get the cotter pin into position, and that just gets pushed through. No, let's not force it. It's a little difficult to kind of do this on camera. I can't really see if everything's lined up. I'm just gonna make sure everything is lined up off camera. Alright. So that gets pushed in. I get a pair of pliers. I don't actually want the cotter pin to be super tight. I want it to just be ever so slightly snug. Did it just roll away on me? Oh, yep. It just rolled off the table when I wasn't looking. Because I don't want to necessarily have to always hammer out the cotter pin. The whole purpose of the cotter pin is just to hold the helix up against that piston so that when I rotate this, if there's any kind of friction at all, this will continue to just go force right through it. Why isn't this going in? There we go. Like so. And then once that is in, you could go ahead, insert that shaft that holds the nib and feed, insert the pin, and again I have to make sure that it gets lined up with that groove so it fits in. At this point here, I would just fill this up with silicone grease so that it doesn't leak out any ink from these threads there. I suppose in the past you could use like shellac or some other adhesive to kind of hold everything together, but I want to be able to actually service this pen very readily, so silicone grease works in my other eyedropper fill pens, so I see no reason why it doesn't work here in this instance. The thread tolerances are actually pretty good. So you just have to slowly screw it in. Once you hit the end where the nib is bumping up towards the end of the body, then you want to just retract the nib back down. You don't have to go all the way, and then just continue tightening that housing until it's a snug fit. And you can see there with the replacement helix, works the same, retracts. The pitch of the helix is slightly different, so you can see it actually takes takes more rotations to actually retract the nib all the way, but that's not a big concern. Still works out fine, and it works. In the future, I'm probably gonna try and make another 3D model of this to actually get a proper double helix. And I would think that the acrylic would actually work a little better than the PLA. The PLA is quite flexy and quite flexible. So it's good and bad. The bad thing is that because the helix actually has some spring to it and it is very flexible, as I'm writing, I can actually, if I write hard enough, I can actually push the nib and feed in, and at that point it'll break that seal that the shaft seals up against, the very bottom of this section, and what ends up happening is ink can actually drip out from there. If you write with proper pressure, very lightly, it's not a big deal, but if you are trying to like do some flex writing, or if you're kind of just poking at it a bit, as you're writing fast and you're not as careful with your pressure, you can start to see some ink build up underneath the feed here, and eventually it will blob out. So with the acrylic one, it's a lot less flexible, and presumably if I get the double helix in and this pin here can actually go through both sides of it, it'll hold on to both sides versus actually having a little bit of give and forcing it down through the center of the helix. But yeah, this pen was basically my first major repair. I've never done any vintage, filling sack replacements or anything. I've only taken apart pens to clean and realign feeds to nibs, but never any actual replacement parts or any fixing of any kind. So maybe safety pen's not the best thing to start off with, but I'm glad it worked out well. And I didn't have to go through the hassle of sending this all the way back to France to get recorked. I was a little hesitant on that because even if I had sent it back and the guy replaced the cork, there was no guarantee that it wouldn't leak again, and I still had the problem of having the cracked helix to deal with. Eventually, like, it may not be completely broken now, and even with the cracks glued up it works, but it's only a matter of time, and I just want them to make sure that before I got too emotionally invested into this pen, that I would actually be able to repair and service it on my own. And it worked out. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.